Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly or semi-weekly weekly briefing with Michael Koplow from the Israel Policy Forum. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. My name is Marina Nebro, and I'm the program manager for adult programs here at Central Synagogue. And I'm really excited to bring Michael back again to update us on what's going on. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Marina. Hi, everybody. So, I'll start off with a few thoughts, and then we can move to people's questions. So, we're standing here today, November 29th, I think at an inflection point that can go in a couple of possible directions. Since the last time we spoke, there's obviously been a huge development, which was the agreement of a hostage release deal and a temporary ceasefire. That was initially 4 days of ceasefire, in return for 50 Israeli hostages being released and 150 Palestinian security prisoners being released, which was then extended for another 2 days. And that extension is set to end at 7 a.m. local time tomorrow, which is midnight tonight here. And the question is, what's going to happen next? Hamas has said that they are in favor of continuing the situation for another 4 days. The reason that 4 days is important is that so far it's been 6, and the Israeli cabinet initially approved up to 10 days without having to take another vote. So under the current Israeli decision-making structure, you can extend this for another 4 days without it going back to the cabinet. And so Hamas has said that they would like another 4 days, and Israel has said that they are willing to keep it going along the same lines, where every day another 10 hostages are released in return for 30 Palestinian security prisoners. And each of those days comes, of course, with a 24-hour ceasefire. But in terms of discussing a much wider deal, Israel says that it is not willing to do that until all of the women and children have been released. And Israeli estimations are that there are somewhere between 20 and 30 women and children still being held hostage by Hamas. Beyond that, there's a larger deal that's being discussed, although I should say that it's not really being discussed by Israel. It is largely being discussed by Qatar and Egypt, and they're trying to get more widespread support for this. And that's the idea of a comprehensive ceasefire. And under this framework, and I should say it's unclear whether this framework is even real or possible, but in terms of what's being bandied about, under this framework, you would have a permanent ceasefire. Israel would get all of the hostages back. In return, Israel would release presumably somewhere north of 5,000 Palestinian security prisoners being held in Israeli prison, and would also commit to not carrying out assassinations of top Hamas leadership. And the idea here, of course, is resolve the hostage situation and completely and get a ceasefire and end the fighting at least until the next big event. And so this is something that Qatar and Egypt are pressing. Whether that deal is even attainable or not, I think it's highly unlikely that Israel would agree to such a deal. The idea of releasing all of those Palestinian prisoners, many of whom are in jail for murder and terrorism and real security offenses, I think even in the current environment inside of Israel, where there is lots of understandable jubilation about getting hostages back, I think even that might be a bridge too far. In addition, what that would effectively do is create a situation where Hamas carried out its attack on October 7th, and at the end of it remains in power, degraded somewhat, but effectively gets thousands of Palestinian prisoners back, which would, of course, be seen as a great success for Hamas, and I think be the evidence, the confirmation that October 7th was a successful operation from Hamas's end. So I don't think this is something that Israel will agree to in any form, but it is being talked about outside of Israel. So, that's one inflection point that we're at, which is what's going to happen next with hostages and how much longer is a ceasefire going to be extended, if at all. The second inflection point we're at is what happens in the next phase of the war, because the war has now been paused for 6 days and may go longer. And when Israel picks back up again, it's likely to look different than it looked before for a number of reasons. First of all, the pause in the fighting and the surge in humanitarian assistance into Gaza has created a new environment and perhaps new expectations on the part of the international community. And I think there's going to be a lot more pressure on Israel when the fighting resumes to try to limit civilian casualties and to try to alleviate the humanitarian situation. And anytime you have a pause like this, simply picking back up as things were before is going to be difficult. Second, it's the operation that has to take place next, which is in southern Gaza, is going to be more complicated. First of all, Israel told residents of the north to move to the south. And so now once you pick up in the south, there, of course, is the question as to where they go next. Second, the casualty rate from the previous operation in the north has left a lot of folks in the United States government, including in the administration, uncomfortable. And just yesterday, the NSC spokesperson, John Kirby, said publicly that the United States is not going to be okay with the same type of operation in the South, especially given that you now have, by most estimates, about 1.7 million Palestinians out of the 2.3 who were in Gaza before, who are now in the South. And so they're concentrated even more so than they were before. And again, they have nowhere to go. So I think there's going to be a decent amount of pressure on Israel, not just from the rest of the world, but from the United States in particular, to carry out an operation in the South in a different way. And that probably means not the same sort of large-scale bombing campaign in preparation for then a surge in ground forces. It probably means more limited airstrikes to be followed up by more limited raids, particularly once you get outside of Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is the refugee camp neighborhood, which is the traditional stronghold of Yahya Sinwar and his brother Mohammed Sinwar. But outside of Khan Yunis, I think you're probably likely to see more targeted raids and a greater effort made to not inflict so many casualties in terms of the civilian death count, and also doing this while managing the humanitarian situation. So, that's a real question as well. And then third, and then we can get to questions. I think there's also we're also sort of at an inflection point in terms of Israeli goals, because Israel started off this war with two broad goals. One was to secure the release of all of the hostages, and one was to eliminate Hamas. And I think there are questions as to whether either of these is possible. I'm not sure it's possible to secure the return of all of the hostages, certainly at a price that Israel is willing to meet. I also am not sure it's possible to eliminate Hamas entirely. And even if these things are possible, they may be operating at cross purposes, because while there's certainly evidence that the military campaign put pressure on Hamas and reduced the cost of hostage releases, I think that any campaign that is meant to eradicate Hamas entirely is probably going to result in the loss of hostage life. And so these two things may be incompatible on their own, even while we question whether either is possible. So the question going forward is going to be whether Israel still holds to both of these in kind of broad absolutist terms, or starts to define victory in a more dialed down way. And I think that's more likely with the military campaign than it is with the hostages. It's hard for me to imagine a situation where Israel ever says that it's okay with securing the release of some hostages, but not all of them. But on the military side of things, there are certainly ways to define victory short of destroying Hamas entirely, whether that means removing Hamas from governing capabilities in Gaza, or whether it means establishing some sort of security parameters that make it far less likely and perhaps even impossible for Hamas to launch a similar type of operation. These are all things that the Israeli government's going to have to contemplate. And considering that at the moment you still have this emergency unity government with Benny Gantz and his party in there, they're not going to stick around forever. And the possibility of them leaving the government and going back into the opposition may also force some decisions on the part of the war cabinet in terms of war aims and sort of when you declare an end to the next phase of the fighting and transition to something else. So all of that is kind of on the table over the next few days and weeks. And these are all things, of course, to look out for. And with that, happy to take questions that people have.
Thank you, Michael. And we do have some questions coming up in the chat, but I encourage everyone to keep those questions coming. You were just talking about the war cabinet, so I want to bring up Ed's question. He says, we are seeing frictions between various segments of the government, including, for instance, Gantz and Smotrich. What is the likelihood of some disruption in this war cabinet?
I think that likelihood is getting stronger. So we saw a real disruption 2 days ago because the Israeli government decided to amend the budget that it had passed back, last spring, in order to deal with the current emergency wartime needs. And the easiest way of doing that was to take the 7 billion shekels in coalition discretionary funds and repurpose them. And some of them were repurposed, but not all of them. A huge number, about $450 million approximately, was held back for these coalition discretionary funds that go to all sorts of things. Haredi schools, which are outside the official education system, promoting Jewish culture and heritage, whatever that might mean. Over $100 million was allocated to settlements. That's also much to claim that it's not for settlements expansion or construction, that it's for security. But that security, entails mostly arming settlers and constructing quote unquote civilian security squads. And I'm sure that some of it will also be used for things like new access roads, for things like new checkpoints, things that all would generally be categorized as settlement expansion and not security. And so Benny Gantz and the other members of his party in the cabinet voted against the budget. Nir Barkat, who is the economy minister from Likud, also voted against the budget, which I think is positioning on his part for the day after Netanyahu. But the budget passed the cabinet, very easily, and now it's going to go to the Knesset, and I'm sure we'll pass there too. And so, that's one point of friction that we're seeing between Benny Gantz's faction and the Netanyahu coalition. And as I said before, Benny Gantz is not going to stick around forever. Like Netanyahu, he also has political considerations, and I don't think that he's going to just stay around as a military campaign drags on and on without any clear standards for victory or for transitioning to another stage. And I also suspect that there will be disputes going forward about Israeli policy in the West Bank, because there is more and more attention being paid to the enormous increase in settler violence, something that is only going to get worse the more that civilian security squads get formed and the more that arms get funneled to them. And it's causing huge tension with the United States. It's also causing some tension between the extremist settlers and the IDF itself. General Yehuda Fuchs, who is the head of IDF Central Command, has been under attack from settlers who have been circulating posters around the West Bank, calling him a traitor and saying that he has no regard for Jewish blood because he's not doing enough to protect settlers. So I think that these clashes are coming on a number of fronts. And while Benny Gantz joined the government in order to have a unified front to prosecute the war in Gaza, I think that as the next phase of the operation moves along, it's going to become more and more difficult for him to stay around. And I'm not sure that his political interests will dictate him staying around for that much longer.
We have a question from Deborah about the hostages and checking in on them. So why had the International Red Cross not checked on the treatment of Hamas hostages being held in Gaza? Was Hamas preventing this from happening previous to the current pause?
Yeah, so there's a lot of anger floating around out there at the Red Cross, and some of it may be justified, but I do think we have to remember that the Red Cross is operating in a situation where they can only do things with the consent of Hamas. The Red Cross is obviously a civilian group. It doesn't have any law enforcement capabilities. It doesn't have any arms. It doesn't have the ability to operate outside of the good graces of the entity that controls the territory on which they operate. And so, there are concerns about whether the Red Cross was willing to take medicines and pass them on to hostages, and there have been concerns about, Red Cross neutrality. But and as I said, some of those may indeed be legitimate, but the same way that we all understand that Hamas is a terrorist group, and that, for instance, when you ask Palestinians to give their opinion of what's happening in Gaza, while Hamas gunmen are standing there, you aren't going to necessarily get an honest response. Similarly, I don't think that the Red Cross is able to function outside of whatever Hamas allows it to do. And I also don't think that it's reasonable to expect that Red Cross employees are going to risk their own lives in order to defy Hamas, given what Hamas is and what Hamas does.
I have a question from Paula. With the US and so many others requesting more surgical strikes, what does that look like? And does that allow the true decapitation of Hamas?
It looks like a few things. It probably looks like Israel using smaller munitions than they have used before. And one of the efforts that the U.S. was doing earlier in the fighting was to send smaller munitions to Israel, smaller bombs that can be used in more targeted ways. It probably also means changing Israel's rules of engagement. One of the things that Israel has done in this conflict relative to previous conflicts in Gaza is to loosen its rules for when and where it bombs different targets. To the best of my knowledge, it absolutely is not targeting civilians. It's targeting things that are Hamas infrastructure. But whereas in the past there may have been a calculation that it's not worth it to go after one Hamas fighter if it means a certain level of collateral damage. To my understanding, this time around, Israel has loosened those rules of engagement, where it is tolerating larger amounts of civilian casualties if it means going after a legitimate Hamas target, as opposed to waiting for that target to perhaps be in a spot where there won't be as much damage. So it probably means reassessing those two things: the type and size of munitions used, and when you actually go after targets. And figuring out what the calculus is in terms of collateral damage. And it also may mean, as I alluded to before, less of an air campaign and more of a ground campaign that is more targeted raids, which should reduce the amount of civilian casualties inside of Gaza, will probably also result in higher IDF casualties. In terms of what it means for decapitating Hamas leadership, that's an unknown. Most people within the Israeli security establishment seem to think they're in the south, but if they're underground, that is of course complicated in terms of the tunnels and getting to them, especially if you are not bombing all the infrastructure above the tunnels to collapse them or to get at them easier. I think there seems to be plenty of evidence now that there's still a Hamas presence in the north in a more robust way than perhaps people thought. And that comes from the fact that some of the hostage releases have been done from the north, where Hamas kind of materialized with these hostages, which means that they were still in the north and being held in the north. So that presents difficulties as well. Of the estimated 32,000 Hamas fighters, 33,000 Hamas fighters that there were before October 7th, Israel's estimates are that they've killed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 of them. That still is a lot of fighters. And Hamas top leadership, as far as we know, are still alive. So I think Israel certainly still has a difficult time going forward. Which brings me back to what I said about 20 minutes ago, or 15 minutes ago, which is this may be a time when Israel wants to reconsider what victory looks like, not as a way of letting Hamas off the hook, but out of a recognition that trying to destroy Hamas entirely is going to be a campaign that takes years. And I'm not sure that the IDF or Israel itself or the rest of the world or the United States is really prepared for this sort of thing to go on at this type of pace and intensity for years.
Speaking of that, you talked a little bit about Egypt and Qatar and their hoping and goals, and the possible shifting of what Israel sees as a goal or a victory. Has there been any broader kind of recognition of goals that like America has or other international communities are putting forth?
I think the U.S. goals are two. One is to continue to give Israel the space to degrade Hamas as much as possible, take care of the security threat, and do what it can to get the hostages back. And second, to really limit the civilian damage in Gaza. The United States, for reasons of morality, wants to see far fewer Palestinian civilian casualties, wants to see a much better effort made at the humanitarian assistance. I also think that we can't discount the politics of this. I don't think that the administration's extremely strong support of the Israeli military campaign has been good for the president politically, and so I think that it would be naive to think that some of these concerns are not bubbling up in terms of what it means for the president's support, what it means for the election. We're now less than 12 months out from the next presidential election, and so I think that that's probably impacting things as well. And if you're the Biden administration and you don't want to kind of sit on the Israelis to shut down the military campaign entirely, and I don't think that that's what the administration wants to do, then the next option is to really have the humanitarian situation be alleviated in as comprehensive a way as possible. And so I think that that is much of the focus for what happens next from the U.S. point of view.
Speaking of the Biden administration, Bruce asks, why is the Biden administration continuing to treat Iran with such deference? And how did the 3-to-1 ratio of hostages to prisoners become the norm?
I disagree with the characterization that the administration is treating Iran with such deference. The U.S. has all sorts of military assets that it's moved into the region, specifically to deter Iran and to deter Iranian proxies. The U.S. has been downing Iranian proxy missiles and UAVs coming from all over the place. The U.S. has suspended any talk of negotiations with Iran over any resumption of the nuclear agreement. Has not lifted any further sanctions. So I disagree with that characterization. Sorry, the second part of the question was what?
How did the 3-to-1 hostage?
3-to-1, right.
Yeah.
So, that's actually an Israeli success, because in 2011, when Gilad Shalit was released, that was for nearly 1,100 Palestinian prisoners, more than half of whom had blood on their hands. And the person at the top of the list was Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in Gaza and is more responsible than anybody for what happened on October 7th. So the agreement this time, which was a ratio of 3-to-1 and which did not include any security prisoners who were convicted of murdering Israelis. There were plenty who were released who had been convicted for violent acts and for attempted murder and for bombings and stabbings, but nobody who actually successfully killed an Israeli. That is widely seen inside of Israel as a success based on what happened before. And I think that if Israel can manage to continue to get hostages released with that 3-to-1 ratio and without releasing the most serious security prisoners in Israeli prisons, based on what we've seen in the past, that will be a good deal in terms of the Israeli calculus.
We have a bunch of questions about the hostages, IDF soldiers, the different casualty rates. And I'm going to bring these all together. So we have a question on how many IDF soldiers have been killed since the start of this operation, how many of the hostages are active IDF soldiers, and lastly, is the 15,000 Gaza civilian number still accurate?
Now, the question of how many IDF soldiers have been killed, I don't know the precise number off the top of my head. I think that we are in, I think we're in the range of, we're in the 70s, maybe in the 80s, but it's still under 100. In terms of the hostages, the estimates are that there are a little over 100 hostages who are active duty Israeli soldiers, but I'm not sure Israel has a complete handle on those numbers yet either. And then in terms of the Palestinian casualty numbers, so obviously those are always hard to verify in any way. A, because of the source, which is the Hamas-run health ministry inside of Gaza. Second, because the Palestinians themselves don't have exact numbers yet. There's been a huge amount of destruction in northern Gaza, and there are still lots of Palestinians missing. And because there is no real heavy equipment in the Gaza Strip, pulling off the rubble and locating everybody, I think, is difficult. So, 15,000, on the one hand, 15,000 may be high. The number may be lower than that because unclear how those numbers are calculated. On the other hand, the number may actually be far higher because that 15,000 may be people, bodies that people have verified and have seen, and there may be thousands of bodies that are still under rubble. And even if the 15,000 number is the most accurate number, it's also unclear how many of those are Hamas fighters, how many of those are other people. If Israel estimates that it has killed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 Hamas fighters, unclear if that's in the 15,000 count or if that's on top of the 15,000 count. So I don't think we can sort of just dismiss the numbers entirely and say they're completely made up, but I don't think they can be verified with any sort of real accuracy.
And we only have 3 more minutes left, so I'm going to ask this question from Deborah, as it also, I think, ties into a program that we are having later this week, so I'll tie that in afterwards. But Deborah mentions that she heard about the failure of IDF higher-ups to take the observation of spotters, all female, of concerning activities of Hamas at the Gaza border. Could you say anything more about this?
There's been a lot of reporting on that that's emerged this week where so yes, many of the spotters who were almost all female along the Gaza border had seen what was going on, had warned superiors, and their warnings were largely dismissed. There was also a report this week that in the press that an IDF female soldier who was higher up in Unit 8200, Shemona Matayim, which is sort of the most important signals intelligence unit within the IDF, had written an actual written report warning about this precise type of attack that was imminent based on what they were seeing and hearing, and passed that report up the chain, and that the report was also dismissed and ignored. And so, what we have is a situation where the people on the ground whose job it was to watch the day-to-day seem to have seen what was going on, and the people who are higher up and whose job it was to take all this and piece it together and create an actual assessment dismissed most of the warnings. I'm sure that there will be a lot more interrogation of the intelligence failure, when the fighting is done. But already there are a lot of things emerging which are pretty disturbing, both in terms of higher ups ignoring the people who report to them, in terms of an almost entirely male hierarchy ignoring an almost entirely female subordinate class of soldiers, in terms of dismissing evidence based on sort of prior theories as opposed to building a theory based on evidence. So all sorts of disturbing things that happened, and I'm sure there is going to be an enormous reckoning, not only in terms of IDF intelligence units, but in terms of IDF command more generally when this is done.
Thank you, Michael, for joining us today. Our next session with Michael will be in December, on December 14th. So if you are here, you already have the link. You'll be getting a reminder about that. And in the chat, I am putting in a few upcoming programs. The first one being tomorrow evening, Leading a Shared Future Israeli Women Since October 7th. I think this really connects to that last question that was asked. We will be hearing from 3 Israeli women, a military hero of October 7th, Anat Marla, Dr. Kochav El-Kayem Levi, a gender issues and human rights specialist, and Colonel Tal Rosen, a trauma specialist, as they talk about their experiences and more female leadership in Israel as we look into the future. Tomorrow, also in the afternoon, we have reports from Israel's home front, our final session of the series with Nama Kelman and Ilan Ezrahi. And we have a 3-part series that started yesterday called Navigating Israel's Crisis, Wisdom from Jewish Teachings. Encourage you to come. Yesterday's program was really interesting. And lastly, on December 5th, Rabbi Angela Bookdahl will be talking with author Dan Senor as they discuss the book, The Genius of Israel. We hope to see you at all of these programs, and especially next month on December 14th for Michael's next update. And so have a great rest of your day. Again, thank you, Michael, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.